Welcome to this press conference of the International Monetary Fund on the Regional Economic Outlook for Latin America and the Caribbean. With us, we have Alejandro Werner, Director of the Western Hemisphere Department of the IMF. And Alejandro will be making a brief introduction, and then he will take your questions. I just wanted to remind the journalists who are with us that they can ask their questions online through the press center, and also they can connect via WebEx. We have a blog that is under embargo. That embargo is lifted at the beginning of this press conference. And with that, I give the floor to Alejandro. Thank you, Maria, and thank you, everyone, for being with us. Good morning. I will be making some brief remarks that summarizes the blog we just published. First of all, the Latin American and Caribbean economies began to bounce back from the COVID-19's initial economic devastation early in 2020, but the pandemic's resurgence towards the end of last year, 2020, still threatens to affect an unequal recovery and worsening the steep social and human costs that have been incurred. As I said, after the sharp contraction in the second quarter, we saw a major recovery of the economies in the third quarter, some of them growing more than what we had foreseen in our forecast for 2020. That is the case of Brazil, Peru, and Argentina. And also, we obviously see that there are differences in the recovery between the services sector that still is lagging well behind the levels that we saw in 2019, and then the manufacturing sector that has recovered significantly. The early indicators, things like industrial production, retail sales, pointed to continuing comeback in the last quarter of last year. And basically, because of that, we upgraded our forecast in terms of contraction in the region from a contraction of minus 8.1% to 7.4%. And also, we upgraded our growth forecast for the region for 2021 to 4.1%. Right now, what we see is that 2021, as our chief economist said, has begun with a race between intensification of contagion, the appearance of new virus strains that spread more readily than other variants, and also the vaccination campaigns will have a positive effect. And all of this will hopefully begin to level out the contagion curve and allow us to return to something more like normal. Now, taking into account those factors, and because of these factors and others I will mention, we increased our forecast for growth to 4.1% from 3.6 that we had previously. And I said this is because of the good way that last year closed. I shouldn't say good, I should say less bad. But we hope that vaccination campaigns will become more and more effective. And also, we have better economic prospects for U.S. growth and better commodity prices. 17 million have fallen into poverty because of the economic effects of this pandemic. We have seen that more than 18 million people have been infected, and something like 500,000 people have lost their lives. So the human costs in terms of lives and also the economic effects, the effects on poverty, all of that have been very steep prices. Now, in keeping with the forecast that I just mentioned and looking ahead to 2022, 2023, etc., we estimate that Latin America will return to the income levels that we had before around 2023, and the per capita income will return to pre-crisis levels by 2025. As we have said, the economic effects of the pandemic have fallen disproportionately on the most vulnerable sectors of our population. That would be low-income families, women, young people, and basically it is those sectors where we have seen the worst and the deepest effects in the labor market. Now, in 2021, we think that within what a fiscal and monetary policy allows in the countries of the region, we should continue to support the most vulnerable businesses and families, those that have been worse affected by the pandemic. And there is the possibility of having major agreements between the executive and the legislative branches of government, sending out signals of fiscal normalization in future years. And that would allow the economies of Latin America to continue to implement programs to support the most affected sectors of the population in 2021, where we still see an uneven and uncertain recovery. And consequently, this continues to require the support of public policy. As we have already said, at this juncture, on one hand, for several countries of the region in 2020, the fiscal space was actually greater than what had been foreseen. And that is probably thanks to the injection of liquidity from the main central banks in the advanced economies because of drops in domestic interest rates in several countries of Latin America. And because of all of that, capital flows have returned to the region, to the governments, but also to the corporate sector in Latin America. And lastly, international organizations have also increased their financial support going to the region. And as far as the International Monetary Fund is concerned, in 2020, the support going to Latin America and the Caribbean with financial programs was close to $66 billion. And that support went to 21 countries in the region. And that is more than 2/3 of the liquidity support given by the IMF to all of our member countries. So it is a very significant support going to the countries of the region. And as our managing director has said, our balance sheet here at the IMF still has capacity in case countries require further support to the regions, and that would include Latin America. So as to backstop those macro economic and fiscal supports to continue to provide support to families and the corporate sector in 2021. In that year, we expect to see an unequal and also an uncertain recovery. So the region requires further support. So with that, Maria, I think that brings me to the end of my closing remarks, and we can go on to our questions. We have a question here from Mexico. Yolanda Morales from Teleeconomista is asking, the economic authorities in Mexico say that our country cannot afford to contract debt to deal with the pandemic because the rate paid by Mexico is not zero. So what is the recommendation for my country? Should we borrow? Will those loans be very costly? Yes, Yolanda, that is something we have commented on previously, and this is an issue where there are some differences of opinion in our team covering Mexico between them and the Mexican authorities. The team that did the Article 4 review felt that Mexico did have space in the financial markets, both national and international, and with the savings of Mexico, contingency lines, etc., we feel that they have space for a fiscal policy that would give greater support to businesses and families in 2020, and that through that support, the economic contraction would be lessened. That was the opinion of the experts that visited Mexico and that follow the Mexican economy, feeling that that would have benefited the population. And it would also have benefited a segment of enterprises, especially the medium sized companies, avoiding bankruptcy and allowing them to return more easily to normal once there is a reactivation of the national and international economies. We feel that Mexico has good market rates and consequently it has fiscal room to support families and enterprises. Now, it's a difference of opinion. Obviously, no one has the absolute truth, but the fact that Mexico in 2020 uh, analyzed giving support to families, all of that leads us to think of options. What is the best option to support the population in terms of those families that are most seriously affected, as well as the companies that are suffering? Another question, Leonardo Flores from Universal in Mexico. Now, why is the review for Mexico optimistic compared to that of other internationals? And how is Banco de Mexico affected in terms of its foreign exchange to make it buy cash dollars without knowing its precedents, their precedents? Well, first of all, this year for Mexico, we foresee 4.3% growth after a contraction of 8.5% in 2020. Mexico's economy already had a second quarter of 2020 where it did have good but unequal economic recovery. I said the manufacturing sector, the export sector did well, and the domestic economy had weaker performance. We see that the consumption of families in Mexico is recovering at a slower pace than what we're seeing in the case of Brazil and the case of Chile and Peru. So, in that connection, you can see that there are two paces of recovery. You can see it clearly in the case of Mexico. But we think that this recovery is going to continue. Also, the fact that the United States is recovering in 2021 so dynamically, that is definitely going to have a positive effect on Mexico's economy. And also, as vaccination campaigns become more and more efficient and effective, we will also see a recovery of the services sector in the economy. So I think that after that 8.5% contraction, especially in view of the strong linkages with one of the advanced economies that will grow at a higher rate in 2021, I'm referring to the United States, the outlook for Mexico is quite prudent and it reflects the forces that we are seeing are already acting on Mexico's economy. Now, regarding the legislation that you just mentioned, you were talking about the possibility of Banco de Mexico purchasing cash dollars from the banking sector. That is a touchy subject. It's a delicate matter that goes beyond the central bank. It also is a matter of governance for the country. Now, does this open up the door for resources coming from illicit proceedings that would put at risk the reputation of Mexico's financial system? It might mean that it would receive criticism in terms of financing terrorism or dealing with money laundering. That's something that has to be explored. Also, it's been said that a high percentage of remittances from Mexicans living in the United States sending money back to Mexico because of work that has been done now for some years. Most of those remittances come in through electronic media. And obviously, we have to look at solutions to make certain that the Mexican workers that send back cash, they need to have a way to digitize and use electronic media to send those funds back to Mexico. So this whole matter of dealing with cash and bills is something that has to be analyzed carefully, because as has already been said by others, the risk, the affecting the trust in Mexico's financial system, the Central Bank of Mexico, uh, is important because the financial system has been considered to be robust in terms of money laundering.
Thank you, Alejandro. We have a question from Ecuador from El Expreso. Yesterday, elections were held in Ecuador. It's likely that they will go to a second round. There will be two candidates who, at least in their discourse, are opposed to the IMF agreement with Ecuador. How do you see that? And are you willing to renegotiate the agreement? As we have said before, and on several occasions, which is the case of the IMF, and the way in which the IMF operates in a number of countries, the IMF is always open to modifying programs, to finding a way to frame the priorities of the different governments and a changing international environment within a macroeconomic situation that will lead to monetary and fiscal balances, and thus, by implementing programs, achieve economic stability, ensuring that this be a precondition for inclusive growth in countries in which we work. So, what I mean is that in the final analysis, there are a number of ways to comply with these conditions. And obviously, when there's a change in administration in a given country, the priorities of the new government's platform have to be incorporated into the economic programs of the country. And in turn, they need to be reflected in the agreements to be reached with the IMF. Of course, as long as these policies have as a final purpose achieving stability, achieving trust and confidence, and this as a basis for inclusive growth, a growth that will allow economies such as Ecuador's to speed up their growth, to generate better and more jobs, and obviously also to strengthen the pillars of a more equitable society. So, as far as we are concerned, obviously, we are open to sitting down, to analyzing the new program or the program of the new administration in Ecuador once a determination has been made of who the new and next president of the country will be, and work with them if the government wishes to do so, and thus be able to find a policy framework that can be supported by a financial program of the IMF. Thank you, Alejandro. And we now go to WebEx questions. Rafael Matos, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Very well. Good morning, Alejandro. How are you? Alejandro, inflation has sped up in Argentina in the last few months, and now the market forecasts that it will reach a level of 50%. In your opinion, what are the reasons for this increase, and what weight does it have in the economic situation? Well, these are subjects on which our teams are working at present with the authorities, both of the central bank and of the Ministry of Economy, trying to understand, obviously, what are the reasons for this inflationary increase, which in the short term could have or could be due to a number of reasons, and what could be the response within the context of the program that is being negotiated with the authorities, and thus go back and reverse this trend and take prices back in a direction where inflation will be decreasing within the context of the program that is being designed by the authorities. And as has been mentioned, that they could be the basis for an agreement with the IMF in May this year. I think it is somewhat premature to disseminate certain preliminary results of the analyses that are being carried out now, both by our team and that are being shared by the authorities. And obviously, when an agreement is reached, the documents will be ready, documents in which these analyses appear. But as of today, we see that there are a number of factors that have had an impact on this situation, on this phenomenon. And as the managing director said, it is important to have a comprehensive program of public policies that will balance and allow for the reestablishment and normalization of fiscal, financial, and price variables on the one hand, and on the other, to still support the beginning of the recovery of the Argentinian economy after the devastating impact of the pandemic. Thank you, Alejandro. We now have a question from Liliana Franco from Ámbito Financiero. Liliana, can you hear us? Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Now we can. Very well. Good morning. Good morning, Alejandro. How are you? Very well, thank you. I have two questions. These are two subjects that the president has mentioned both on the record and off the record from the presidential palace. First, due to the increase in domestic prices, especially of some food products, the government is thinking once again of considering withholding certain products, certain commodities such as corn, wheat, and others, but as a tool only. So I wish to know what your opinion is on this increase in withholdings to exports. And the second point, and the president said that on the record, is that there's a need for the IMF to consider that the facility, the IMF facility, go beyond the deadline of 7 to 10 years. In Argentina, they're saying that ideally an agreement should be reached for a term of 20 years. Do you think that these rules of the IMF could be more flexible, could become more flexible? I would like to interrupt to add one other question that we have online from Paula Lugones from El Clarín in Argentina, and then I will give you the floor, Alejandro. Paula asked, what are the most difficult points to cover in the current IMF negotiations with Argentina? And you said that May is a tentative date for an agreement. Is this feasible or is this maybe too ambitious a date? As has been mentioned by the managing director, clearly our teams are working intensively there, and the Argentinian authorities, of course, working intensively too, to ensure that we cover the need to reach an agreement by May. It is an ambitious date, but I think it is feasible. And obviously, we have to work intensively on this in order to reach the agreements that could become the foundation of a program that will be supported by our board of directors and that will be able to provide the resources needed by Argentina's external accounts to achieve the stability of the capital accounts and thus support a domestic program that, as I said before, can lead to good balance between making sure that the Argentinian economy gets to a situation where external accounts are balanced, are well balanced, where there's a good balance also in the fiscal and monetary situation, and also stabilizing the economy with the support that this economy still needs to recover from the devastating impact of the pandemic on the Argentinian economy. We estimate that last year the Argentinian economy contracted by about 10.4%, and we estimate that it will grow by 4.5% this year. The most important elements in the negotiation, well, that question I think needs to wait until there's an agreement in the program and when we see the documents that will show which are the most important elements of the program. Now, with regard to this subject that you mentioned, that of changing our facilities, obviously that subject has to be dealt with by our board of directors, not by the staff, not by the IMF staff. Therefore, I am not able to really answer your question. Now, as for domestic prices, obviously, from the inflationary point of view, the IMF staff's opinion is that obviously the most important point to revert this upward trend in the inflationary process are to have fiscal and monetary policies that are based on a midterm framework that will lead to stabilizing the growth or increase in prices and not so much to operate directly on some specific prices, as important as they may be. But obviously, a more in depth analysis has to be made of specific proposals within a more comprehensive context of implementing macro fiscal policies in the Republic of Argentina. Thank you, Alejandro. We now go to another question on WebEx. I will switch to English.
Sí. Alejandro, muy buenos días. Una pregunta.
Can you speak a bit about the risks for Latin America's regional economy as a result of the possibility of more transmission, more COVID cases, more deaths, and more restrictions? What impact could that have on Latin American economies? Could they go back to growth levels pre-pandemic, even if these issues are not settled? And I also wish to ask about the region in general. The fact that maybe you're about to renegotiate a new program with Ecuador 2 years after Argentina. Does that mean something about the needs of the region, about the political situation? So, what can you say about this situation or about the second renegotiation in only 2 years? This for an important economy in the region. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Both questions are very important. The first question is the first answer is that to the extent that we do not see a major reduction in transmission and especially, or infected people and especially deaths and especially given the hospital capacity of Latin America during the second half of this year or the second quarter even, well, the recovery that we're forecasting, this 4.1% recovery that we were forecasting for 2021 would obviously be at risk. As I said, the upgraded view that we did and the recovery that we're seeing of 4.1% after a fall of 7.5% last year is based, first of all, on realizing that an economy such as the US economy, which is so important for the region, will have a dynamic economic growth in 2021. This will help. We're also seeing that many prices of major raw materials in the region have a favorable behavior, but we're also assuming that in those sectors that depend more on individual interactions, especially the service sector, that there begin to be a greater economic recovery behind a reduction, of course, in infections and a reduction in mortality. And we will see a lower saturation in the hospital capacity in Latin America. If there's if there are no major achievements in vaccinations, if we cannot revert the trends we have seen in the last few months regarding infections and mortality, then clearly that recovery will be at risk. And as far as the revision of the yearly prospects that we will submit in April during the spring meetings, we will show alternative scenarios, risk scenarios, which will quantify the possible impact of these possible scenarios, where a situation could arise in which the pandemic does not decrease as we have forecasted in our central forecast. Regarding your second question, which is an important point for the region, in the final analysis, after a cycle of growth in terms of trade and raw materials that we saw between 2003 and 2015, and since Latin America depends so much on raw materials, the fall in these terms of trade and the prices of these raw materials has led to a situation in which they're accommodating to a new reality in which domestic income is lower because of this reduction in raw material prices, which in turn has led to the implementation of a number of policies that have generated these political cycles that we're seeing in the region. So we see that there is economic complexity where democracy is still operating normally, but society is at the same time looking for a number of alternatives to help them to manage the economic and social problems resulting from the adjustment in prices of raw materials. And given that scenario, as was mentioned before, our teams need to be open to negotiating with the authorities in the various countries, negotiating economic programs that will solve or that will likely solve the fundamental problems faced by these economies, but also take into account the priorities of the different governments to the extent that societies vote for a number of different parties. That I think reflects the priorities of the societies where they wish to achieve economic stability, but also they wish to emphasize certain subjects such as the environment or social support, a labor market that is open to different aspects. But all governments wish to, of course, achieve these election priorities within a context in which economies become increasingly stable and can become more predictable, achieve more investments, have growth in jobs, and reach inclusive growth. So this is a difficult time for the region. We have seen that it is a region that has seen one of the greatest falls in the economic activity in 2020, and this goes hand in hand with an economic growth which had slowed down in a major way as of 2014, which had already led to social tensions in a number of countries. And this, of course, will require major social consensus to ensure that the Latin American economies achieve stability, but also reestablish their inclusive growth in the next few years so that Latin America can create jobs, finance an expansion in the social safety network, a network that supports education and health, and have a more dynamic, inclusive growth.
Perfecto.
Great. Thank you, Alejandro. Now we have a question from Juan Galindo from Semana in Colombia. The question: Does the IMF think that the region needs to implement structural reforms to guarantee the economic recovery? Delaying the vaccination process against coronavirus, can it affect the economic recovery in Colombia? Well, as I said before, thinking of the region, if there is a delay into the second half of this year, say if by then we haven't seen a significant change in the most visible indicators regarding the way the pandemic is unfolding, that can definitely have an impact on the recovery, both in the region and in Colombia. And what was the first part of the question? The first question had to do with structural reforms to assure economic recovery. For Latin America as a whole, and this also applies to Colombia, it is going to be very important once the situation begins to return to normal. It will be important to reach significant agreements so as to allow activity of the state in areas where the pandemic has shown us require stronger public action. That would be public health, strengthening the economy, and also education for the population. Now, at the same time, so as to be able to accomplish this within a context that is fundable by the government, their public finance will have to take measures so that the economy can grow quickly in a context of this nature. Each country is going to have to look at policy changes, reforms that could speed up growth, open up greater opportunities, and reduce the cost for these public activities. So the post-pandemic scenario in many countries of Latin America is going to call for a social consensus. And in those countries that have shown that the state is weak in areas like education or health, those areas are going to have to be strengthened in a context of healthy fiscal positions and open up ways so that the private sector can accelerate its investment, producing well-paid jobs, and that will contribute to the growth process by improving the social indicators. And that is going to require a social agreement that would cover not only structural reforms so as to make the public sector led economy more competitive, but also to allow us to take action in the sectors of the economy where the pandemic has shown there are major weaknesses. And all of this within the context of climate change. Many analysts have said if we saw the brutal effects of the pandemic, many analysts are now saying that the effects of climate change across time will be even greater. So we definitely have to prepare ourselves for that. Alejandro, we have a question that comes from Chile. Francisca Guerrera from La Tercera says, how do you explain that Chile's outlook for 2021 is better than the forecast for the region? Is it because of its fiscal situation in an area where interest rates are low? Will this be long-lasting? Well, in Chile, we saw significant fiscal support, and also we have seen the commitment to maintain the fiscal support in 2021. It's clear that the regional comment that the fiscal space wound up being greater than what we had initially thought, and that this opens a door to giving significant support to the population. That comment applies to all the countries across the board. But in the case of Chile, I would say that Chile also had a situation in 2019 where its growth was low because of the social tensions, because of the protests that Chile experienced in the second half of 2019. So that means that the point of comparison was lower, and that helped the growth projection. Now, especially in the first two quarters of 2021, we'll be seeing the impact on consumption and aggregate demand because of the withdrawals from pension funds. And although that weakens the pension system, and we think that that is dangerous, on the side of aggregate demand, it helps that aggregate demand go up significantly, and that supports recovery. Then, third, we see that metal prices are performing well, and that obviously boosts Chile's economy. And we're also seeing that reflected in the significant recovery that we are seeing in Peru's economy, where metal prices are an important factor. Thank you, Alejandro. Now we will switch into English.
They're asking, tourism has shown its resilience before, but given its vulnerabilities, should Barbados and the Caribbean focus on economic diversification? What sectors should they focus on? And then another question, how can the Caribbean go about tackling its unemployment problem, especially among youth, and the need for more social safety nets during the crisis?
So clearly, I mean, Barbados and the Caribbean have been facing this challenge of economic diversification for a long time, and the pandemic makes it so much more clear the huge risk of depending so much on one activity. Clearly, economic diversification is something that it's extremely complex to achieve. I think the most clear way to start this agenda, and that many Caribbean countries have been following, is basically to try to deepen the supply chain links in the tourism sector. I mean, to what extent you can provide more of the inputs to the tourism services sector locally instead of importing them from abroad should be an element. Obviously, developing other service sectors that are in which, I mean, having excel in the hotel and hospitality sector, there are other sectors that might require similar inputs, characteristics, etc., that could be developed in the Caribbean to diversify its economy. But it's definitely a very complex challenge that requires the elimination of excessive controls to economic activity to make your economies much more flexible, etc. That the Caribbean is showing within the tourism sector, reacting, for example, very quickly to allowing long-term stays in the Caribbean during this pandemic, giving visas, etc., for people to go and work from the Caribbean. Obviously, for this would be very important to strengthen the telecom infrastructure in the Caribbean. So if you're thinking about diversifying away from tourism, but continuing doing the service sector, obviously, I mean, strengthening the infrastructure of the main inputs for the service sector, such as telecom. It's very important to provide a very strong competitive base for these sectors to operate from the Caribbean. I think, as we have said, it is very important to continue to provide support to those families that have been severely affected from the lack of work in the Caribbean due to the closure of many hotels, the very low rates of operation of the tourism sector, etc. And for that, it will be important to establish medium-term programs that basically would guarantee medium-term fiscal sustainability, but that will allow short-term stimulus to be implemented. And I think that's the key. The more you can guarantee that in the medium term your financial situation will be sustainable, the more space you will have today to act in a more aggressive way to support the population. No? And I think that's something in which some countries in the Caribbean have been moving faster, and obviously that throughout 2021 we will see, I mean, maybe more countries opening up fiscal space in this way. And as I said before, I mean, the IMF is extremely open to support this type of programs with financial resources. We have deployed around $1 billion of financing to the Caribbean last year, and obviously there's important space in our balance sheet to continue to support the Caribbean during 2021 to implement these type of programs in which you have the expectation and the consensus to move to a stable financial situation in the medium term, but obviously to provide a lot of support during these very tough periods of the pandemic in 2021.
Thank you, Alejandro. Muchas gracias. Con esto ya.
Thank you, Alejandro. And that brings us to the end of our press conference. I wanted to thank everyone for submitting questions, everyone that contacted us through the press center or through WebEx. Have a good day. Thank you.